The scent of stale coffee and betrayal hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sweet fragrance of the lilies clutched in Victoria's trembling hand. It was their 3rd anniversary, a day that had dawned with whispered promises and gentle caresses from her husband, Edward Thorne. Now, standing outside the gleaming chrome and glass edifice of Thorne Holdings, a wave of nausea sharper than her usual morning sickness washed over her. It wasn't just the 6 months of pregnancy pressing on her bladder. It was a gut-wrenching premonition, a cold dread that whispered a serpent had slithered into her perfect paradise. The serpent, she would soon discover, wore a seraphine gown and was comfortably seated in her chair. Victoria had always believed in fairy tales. How could she not? She was living one. From a humble background, working as a junior art curator, she had met Edward Thorne, the billionaire real estate magnate, at a charity auction. He was older, devastatingly handsome, with eyes the color of a stormy sea that seemed to see right into her soul. He had pursued her with a relentless, old-world charm, showering her with affection, respect, and a life she had only ever dreamed of. Their wedding was a lavish affair, a feature in Lux Living magazine, and their life together in their sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park was, by all accounts, perfect. Now 6 months pregnant with their first child, a son, Victoria felt a completeness she had never known. Edward was ecstatic, attentive, and more loving than ever. He'd personally overseen the design of the nursery, a masterpiece of soft blues and creams with a hand-painted mural of whimsical hot air balloons. He would talk to her belly for hours, telling their unborn son about the adventures they would have, the empires he would one day inherit. That morning had been no different. He'd woken her with a kiss, a single perfect red rose on her pillow, and the whispered words, "Happy anniversary, my love. Tonight, we celebrate." He had a board meeting, a crucial one, he'd said, but promised to be home early for a special dinner he had planned. Victoria had spent the day in a state of blissful anticipation. She'd had a prenatal massage, bought a new elegant maternity gown from Seraphine, and decided to surprise Edward at his office with his favorite lunch, a bespoke bento box from Nobu. She wanted to see the look on his face, that heart-stopping smile that always made her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. As she stepped out of the private elevator that opened directly into the executive suite of Thorne Holdings, she was greeted by Edward's long-suffering but impeccably polite secretary, a woman in her late 50s named Margaret. "Mrs. Thorne." "What a lovely surprise," Margaret said, her smile a little tighter than usual. "Mr. Thorne is in a meeting at the moment." "Oh, I know," Victoria said, her own smile radiant. "He told me it was an important one. I just wanted to drop off his lunch. And these," she added, gesturing to the bouquet of white lilies, Edward's favorite. Margaret's eyes flickered towards the double doors of Edward's office. A flicker so brief Victoria almost missed it. "Of course, I can take them in for you." "Nonsense, Margaret. I'll just pop in for a second." "He won't mind," Victoria said, her voice light and breezy. She moved towards the doors, a sense of playful excitement bubbling within her. "Mrs. Thorne, perhaps it's best to wait." Margaret's voice was strained, a note of desperation creeping in, but Victoria was already pushing open the heavy oak doors. The scene that greeted her was one that would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life, a tableau of such profound betrayal that it stole the very breath from her lungs. The office was as grand and imposing as the man who occupied it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a concrete jungle that Edward had conquered. His massive mahogany desk was usually a controlled chaos of files and blueprints, but today, it was what was happening in front of the desk that held Victoria's horrified gaze. There, in the plush, custom-made leather chair that Edward had always called Victoria's chair, the one she sat in when she visited him, the one where they'd shared countless conversations and dreams, sat a woman. Her long, raven hair was styled in a sleek, sophisticated bob. She was wearing a slinky emerald green dress that clung to her slender frame like a second skin. Her legs were crossed, a stiletto-heeled Louboutin dangling provocatively from her foot. And on his knees before her was her husband, Edward Thorne. His head was in her lap, his shoulders shaking with what Victoria, in her naivety, first thought was grief. The woman was stroking his hair, her long, crimson-nailed fingers tracing patterns on his scalp. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one moved. The bento box slipped from Victoria's numb fingers, clattering to the polished marble floor. The sound, a sharp, jarring note in the suffocating silence, broke the spell. Edward's head shot up. His sea-storm eyes, usually filled with adoration for her, were now wide with a mixture of shock, guilt, and something else Victoria couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of anger. The woman in the chair, however, showed no such discomposure. She simply tilted her head, a slow, languid movement, and a smug, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. Victoria knew her. Of course, she knew her. It was Isabella Romano, the fiercely ambitious, notoriously ruthless chief operating officer of Thorn Holdings, a woman Edward had always described as brilliant, but a shark. Victoria had met her at company galas, had exchanged polite, meaningless pleasantries with her. She had never liked her, had always felt a strange, unsettling energy from her. Now she knew why. Victoria, Edward gasped, scrambling to his feet. He looked disheveled, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his tie loosened. This isn't what it looks like. The classic, pathetic cliché hung in the air, a testament to the depth of his deceit. Victoria's gaze moved from her husband's guilty face to the woman who was now slowly, deliberately standing up. Isabella was taller than Victoria had realized, her presence commanding, her green eyes cold and assessing. She ran a hand down her dress, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle, a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Isn't it? Isabella's voice was like honey laced with arsenic. It looks to me like your husband was seeking a little comfort. The pressures of a multi-billion-dollar empire, you know. They can be so draining. The condescension in her tone was a physical blow. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The lilies, once a symbol of her love and celebration, now felt like a funeral wreath in her hand. Get out of my chair, Victoria's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. Isabella raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Your chair, darling. This is the seat of power. And as you can see, it's currently occupied. Edward, Victoria's voice cracked. She finally looked at her husband, her eyes pleading with him to deny it, to fix this, to wake her from this living nightmare. Tell her to get out. Edward ran a hand through his hair, his face a mask of turmoil. He looked from his devastated, pregnant wife to his coolly composed mistress. The silence in the room was a roaring inferno, consuming the last vestiges of Victoria's fairy tale. Isabella, Edward finally said, his voice strained. Perhaps you should go. Isabella let out a low, throaty laugh. Go. But we were just getting to the good part, weren't we, Edward? The part where you tell me how you're going to leave this relic of a marriage and finally be with a woman who understands your world, your ambition. That's enough. Edward snapped, a flash of anger in his eyes, but the damage was done. The words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. They hung in the air, venomous and irrefutable. Victoria felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her abdomen. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. The room began to spin, the panoramic view of the city blurring into a kaleidoscope of mocking lights. Victoria! Edward cried out, taking a step towards her. Don't touch me, she whispered, the words laced with a pain so profound it was almost a physical force. She took a step back, then another, her eyes never leaving his. She saw him not as the man she loved, the father of her child, but as a stranger, a liar, a betrayer. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she turned and fled. She didn't hear Edward calling her name, didn't hear Isabella's derisive laughter. The only sound was the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart, a drumbeat marking the end of her world. She stumbled out of the office, past a horrified Margaret who rushed to her side. Mrs. Thorne, are you all right? Let me call someone. But Victoria shook her head, pushing past her. She ran towards the elevator, her breath coming in ragged sobs. As the doors slid shut, she caught a final glimpse of Edward standing in the doorway of his office, his face a portrait of despair. But it was too late. The glass had shattered, the pieces too small, too sharp to ever be put back together again. The fairy tale was over. And in its place, a brutal, unforgiving reality had begun, the reality of a pregnant wife, a cheating husband, and a mistress who had not only stolen her man but had also dared to sit in her chair. A war had been declared in that opulent office, and Victoria, with her unborn child as her only ally, knew she had to fight back. The naive girl who believed in fairy tales was gone. In her place, a woman scorned and determined was slowly, painfully being born. The elevator descended, a metallic cage plummeting Victoria back to a world that no longer made sense. Each floor it passed was a layer of her life being stripped away. The penthouse, their home, now felt like a gilded cage. The future she had so carefully, so lovingly built with Edward was now a pile of rubble at her feet. She stumbled out into the bustling lobby of Thorne Holdings, a ghost in a designer maternity dress. The security guards, men who usually greeted her with deferential smiles, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion. She ignored them, pushing her way through the revolving doors and out into the jarring noise of the city. The cacophony of sirens, horns, and the endless chatter of people was a stark contrast to the deafening silence in her heart. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked, her feet carrying her aimlessly through the crowded streets of Manhattan. The city that had once felt like a playground now felt like a labyrinth, each corner a reminder of a memory now tainted by betrayal. A bistro where they'd had their first date. A park where he had proposed. A theater where they'd shared their first public kiss. Each memory was a fresh stab of pain. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her purse. Edward. The name on the screen, once a source of comfort and joy, now ignited a fresh wave of nausea. She ignored it, letting the calls go to voicemail. Each missed call was a small act of defiance, a tiny reclaiming of her shattered self. Finally, her legs gave out. She found herself in front of a small, independent art gallery in Soho, a place she hadn't visited since her life had been consumed by the whirlwind that was Edward Thorne. It was a world away from the high-stakes, high-society art auctions she now frequented. This was a place of raw, unpolished talent, a place where art was a passion, not an investment. She went inside. The familiar scent of oil paint and turpentine was a strangely comforting balm to her wounded soul. The gallery owner, a kind-faced bohemian woman named Clara, who had been a mentor to Victoria in her early career, looked up from her desk. Victoria. My goodness, it's been too long, Clara said, her smile warm and genuine. But then she saw Victoria's face, the tear-streaked mascara, the haunted look in her eyes. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of deep concern. My dear, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. I've seen the truth. And there, amidst the canvases of aspiring artists, the story of her perfect life's ugly underbelly came pouring out. She told Clara everything, the anniversary, the surprise, the scene in the office, the woman in her chair, the smug smile, the devastating words. She spoke until she was hollow, until the tears had run dry, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. Clara listened patiently, her expression a mixture of sympathy and a quiet, simmering anger. When Victoria had finished, Clara took her hand, her touch firm and grounding. Men like Edward Thorne, Clara said, her voice filled with a weary wisdom, they build empires of glass and steel, but their hearts are often made of something far more fragile, far more corruptible. And women like Isabella Romano, they are the vultures who circle those empires, waiting for a moment of weakness. What do I do, Clara? Victoria asked, her voice filled with a desperate plea. I have nothing. My life, my home, my future, it was all tied to him. You have yourself, Victoria, Clara said fiercely. And you have that precious life inside you. That is not nothing. That is everything. Clara's words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within Victoria. For the first time since she had fled that office, a tiny spark of something other than despair flickered within her. It was a spark of anger, of a fight she didn't know she had in her. Meanwhile, back at Thorn Holdings, Edward was in a state of frantic panic. After Victoria had fled, he had turned on Isabella, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. "Get out," he had said, his face pale with a mixture of fury and fear. Isabella, for the first time, looked taken aback. She had expected a different reaction, had expected him to finally, decisively choose her. "Edward, darling," she had purred, trying to regain control. "This is a blessing in disguise. Now we can be together openly." Together? Edward had laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "There is no us. There was never going to be an us. You were a diversion, a mistake." The words hit Isabella like a slap in the face. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled, revealing the raw, wounded pride beneath. "A mistake? I am not a mistake, Edward. I am your equal. I am the one who understands you, who challenges you. Not that simpering little doll you married. Don't you dare talk about her." Edward had roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous office. "You don't know the first thing about her." "I know that she's weak," Isabella had spat back, her eyes flashing with a venomous fire. "And I know that you will come crawling back to me. You always do." With that, she had stormed out of his office, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and shattered promises. Now alone in his office, the silence was a suffocating blanket. He looked at the spilled bento box, the scattered lilies, the symbols of his wife's love, now ruined on the floor. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. What had he done? He had betrayed the one person who had loved him unconditionally, the one person who had brought light and warmth into his cold, sterile world. He called her phone again and again, each unanswered call a fresh twist of the knife in his gut. He called her friends, her mother, but no one had seen her. He was a man who could track a stock market fluctuation in real time, a man who could predict the rise and fall of global economies, but he couldn't find his own wife. He felt a helplessness that was entirely foreign to him, a terrifying void where his usual confidence and control used to be. He didn't know it yet, but the storm that was gathering was far bigger than a marital spat. Isabella, her pride wounded and her ambitions thwarted, was not a woman to be trifled with. She had been his confidant, his partner in ambition, and his lover. She knew his secrets, his vulnerabilities, his every weakness. And she was not about to go down without a fight. She had a plan, a contingency for every eventuality, and the humiliation she had just suffered had just activated her most ruthless one yet. And Victoria, cocooned in the quiet sanctuary of Clara's art gallery, was also undergoing a transformation. The tears had been shed. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She had been a fool, a naive girl playing dress-up in a world she didn't understand. But she was also a mother-to-be, and the fierce, primal instinct to protect her child was now a roaring fire in her veins. She looked at Clara, her eyes no longer filled with despair, but with a steely resolve. "He's not going to get away with this, Clara. He thinks I'm weak. They both do. But they have no idea who they're dealing with." The battle lines had been drawn. On one side, a billionaire consumed by guilt and a desperate need for redemption. On the other, a scorned mistress armed with secrets and a thirst for revenge. And in the middle, a pregnant wife who had just discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The storm was coming. And when it broke, it would threaten to destroy not just a marriage, but an entire empire. The drama was just beginning, and the players were about to find out that hell hath no fury like a woman and a mother scorned. The next few days were a blur of calculated moves and quiet desperation. Victoria, with Clara's help, found a small, discreet apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a far cry from the opulent penthouse that now felt like a mausoleum of broken dreams. She changed her number, creating a digital fortress around herself, a space where Edward's incessant calls and apologetic texts could not penetrate. She also made a crucial call, one that would set the stage for the battle to come. She called Arthur Vance, the most feared divorce lawyer in the city, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and his take-no-prisoners approach to litigation. "Mrs. Thorne," Arthur's voice was calm and measured over the phone. "I've been expecting your call." Victoria was taken aback. "You have?" When a man like Edward Thorne, a man with a net worth that rivals a small country's GDP, has a public indiscretion, the vultures start to circle. "I, however, prefer to be the eagle." Victoria felt a flicker of hope. "I need your help, Mr. Vance. I want to leave him, but I want to do it on my own terms." "And what are your terms, Mrs. Thorne?" "I want to be financially independent," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I want to secure my son's future. And I want to make sure that Isabella Romano does not profit from my pain." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Arthur Vance let out a low chuckle. "Mrs. Thorne, I do believe this is the beginning of a beautiful, and very profitable, partnership." Arthur's first piece of advice was simple but powerful. Do not engage with him. Do not answer his calls. Do not respond to his messages. Let him stew in his own guilt. A desperate man makes mistakes. And we will be there to capitalize on every single one of them. And so, Victoria began her new life in the shadows, a life of quiet determination. She started visiting the art gallery again, not as a patron but as a collaborator. She began to use her knowledge of the art world, her eye for talent, to help Clara curate a new exhibition. The work was a welcome distraction, a way to channel her pain and anger into something productive, something that was hers and hers alone. Meanwhile, Edward was a man on the brink. The silence from Victoria was a form of torture he had never experienced. He was used to getting what he wanted, to solving problems with a phone call or a checkbook. But this was different. This was a wound he couldn't close, a chasm he couldn't bridge. His work suffered. He was distracted, irritable, his Midas touch seemingly deserting him. He made a series of uncharacteristically poor business decisions, his mind clouded by the personal turmoil that consumed him. The board of Thorne Holdings, a group of powerful, ruthless men who cared more about profit margins than personal problems, were starting to get nervous. And then there was Isabella. After her dramatic exit from his office, she had become a ghost. She still came to work, her performance as impeccable as ever. But the easy camaraderie, the late-night brainstorming sessions, the stolen moments of intimacy, they were all gone. She was a block of ice, her green eyes holding a chillingly professional distance. She was playing a waiting game, and Edward, for all his business acumen, couldn't figure out her next move. He tried to apologize, to explain. He cornered her in her office one evening, his voice pleading. "Isabella, we need to talk." She looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about, Edward. We had a professional relationship that crossed a line. It's over. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a quarterly report to finalize." Her coldness was more unnerving than any outburst of anger. He had underestimated her pride, her ambition, her capacity for revenge. The first move in Isabella's game of chess came a week later. An anonymous tip was leaked to a notorious gossip columnist, a man named Marco Diaz, whose online portal, the Diaz Report, was the scourge of the city's elite. The tip was simple yet devastatingly effective. Edward Thorne, the golden boy of New York real estate, was having an affair with his COO, the formidable Isabella Romano. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, and it spread like wildfire. The headlines were salacious, the details embellished, but the core of the story was true, and it was enough to send shockwaves through the city's financial district. The board of Thorne Holdings called an emergency meeting. The company's stock, which had already been faltering due to Edward's erratic behavior, took a nosedive. The scandal was a breach of the company's code of conduct, a PR nightmare that threatened to tarnish the carefully crafted image of Thorn Holdings. Edward found himself in the crosshairs, his personal life suddenly the subject of intense public scrutiny. He was hounded by paparazzi, every move documented, his every expression analyzed. The man who had once been the king of the city was now its most celebrated villain. In her quiet apartment, Victoria read the news with a strange sense of detachment. She had expected it, had known that Isabella would not go down quietly. But seeing the sordid details of her husband's betrayal laid bare for the world to see was a fresh wave of pain. "This is her doing," Victoria said to Arthur Vance over the phone, her voice cold and hard. "Of course it is," Arthur replied, his tone unflappable. "This is a classic scorched earth tactic. She's trying to devalue the company, to create chaos. She's probably hoping that the board will oust Edward and put her in his place." "Will they?" Victoria asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "They might," Arthur admitted. "Which is why we need to make our move. The prenup you signed, it's ironclad. But it also has a morality clause, and your husband has just violated it in the most public way imaginable." "So, what does that mean?" "It means we have leverage, Mrs. Thorne. It means we can go after more than just the standard settlement. We can go after a piece of the pie. A very big piece." Arthur's plan was audacious, a masterstroke of legal maneuvering. He filed for divorce on Victoria's behalf, citing adultery and emotional distress. But he also filed an injunction, a move that would freeze a significant portion of Edward's personal assets and, more importantly, a portion of his shares in Thorn Holdings. The injunction sent a shockwave through the company, a move far more damaging than the gossip column headlines. It signaled to the board, to the shareholders, that this was not just a messy divorce. This was a hostile takeover bid orchestrated by the scorned wife of their CEO. Edward was blindsided. He had expected a quiet, dignified divorce, a generous settlement, a clean break. He had not expected this. He had not expected his sweet, gentle Victoria to have this much fight in her. He called her, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. This time, she answered. Her voice was cool, calm, and utterly devoid of the warmth he so desperately missed. "Victoria, what are you doing? An injunction? You're going to destroy the company." "You did that yourself, Edward," she replied, her voice steady. "You and Isabella. I'm just protecting my son's future." "Our son, Victoria. Our son. You forfeited your right to say, 'our,' when you knelt before another woman in my chair," she said, the words sharp and precise. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. He had no response, no defense. She had checkmated him. The first move had been made. Victoria, the pawn in this game of power and betrayal, had just transformed into a queen. She had taken control of the board, had thrown the king and his treacherous knight into a state of disarray. The war was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. And as the dust settled from this first explosive move, one thing was clear: Victoria Thorne was not going down without a fight. She was going to burn his kingdom to the ground and from the ashes, build an empire of her own. The injunction was a masterstroke. It sent the board of Thorn Holdings into a tailspin. With a significant portion of Edward's shares frozen, his control over the company he had built from the ground up was suddenly precarious. The vultures, as Arthur Vance had so eloquently put it, began to circle. Board members who had once been loyal allies now saw an opportunity, a power vacuum waiting to be filled. And at the center of this burgeoning chaos was Isabella Romano. The scandal she had orchestrated had backfired in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had intended to weaken Edward, to make him vulnerable, to force the board's hand. She had not expected Victoria to retaliate with such a devastatingly effective legal maneuver. The injunction not only hurt Edward, it hurt the company, and by extension, it hurt her. She found herself in a precarious position. The board, while wary of Edward, was also deeply suspicious of her. They saw her as the catalyst for the crisis, a liability that threatened the stability of the entire enterprise. Her dream of taking the CEO's chair was slipping through her fingers. Desperate to regain control, Isabella made her next move, a move born of hubris and a chilling lack of morality. She decided to leak another story to Marco Diaz, a story that would not only discredit Victoria but would also paint Edward as a victim, manipulated by a gold-digging, unstable wife. The story that appeared in the Diaz report was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It painted Victoria as a social climber who had trapped Edward into marriage by getting pregnant. It hinted at a history of emotional instability, of irrational jealousy, of a woman who was using her pregnancy as a weapon to extort a fortune from her long-suffering husband. The article was a brutal character assassination, and it hit Victoria like a physical blow. To see her love for Edward, her joy over her pregnancy, twisted into something so ugly, so venal, was a violation that cut deeper than the initial betrayal. The public, ever fickle, began to turn. The narrative shifted. Victoria, the wronged wife, was now a manipulative shrew. Edward, the cheating husband, was now a tragic figure, a man trapped in a toxic marriage. "This is a declaration of war," Arthur Vance said, his voice grim as he read the article aloud to Victoria in his office. "She's not just trying to win a divorce settlement. She's trying to destroy you." Victoria, who had been so strong, so resolute, felt herself begin to crumble. The constant stress, the public humiliation, the weight of her pregnant side was all becoming too much. "I don't know if I can do this, Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm drowning." "You are not going to drown, Mrs. Thorne," Arthur said, his voice firm. "You are going to swim. And I am going to be the shark that swims alongside you." Arthur's team of investigators began to dig into Isabella's past, searching for any skeletons in her closet, any leverage they could use to fight back. And what they found was more shocking, more damning than they could have ever imagined. Isabella Romano, the self-made woman, the brilliant COO, had a secret. A very big secret. She had a daughter, a child she had given up for adoption years ago, a child she had erased from her life in her relentless pursuit of power and success. The revelation was a bombshell. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. A woman who had painted Victoria as a manipulative mother was herself an absentee one. "This is it," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "This is the silver bullet." But Victoria hesitated. To use a child, an innocent, in this sordid affair felt wrong. It felt like stooping to Isabella's level. "I don't want to hurt her child," Victoria said, her hand instinctively going to her own belly. "This isn't about hurting the child," Arthur argued. "This is about exposing the hypocrisy of the woman who is trying to destroy you. This is about leveling the playing field." Victoria was torn. But then she thought about her own child, about the world he would be born into, a world where his mother was being vilified, his father's legacy in tatters. She thought about the cold, calculating cruelty of Isabella Romano, and her resolve hardened. "Do it," she said, her voice a whisper. The story of Isabella's secret daughter was leaked not to the salacious Marco Diaz, but to a respected, serious journalist at the New York Times. It was a strategic move, designed to lend credibility to the story, to frame it not as gossip but as a serious investigation into the character of a high-powered executive. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Isabella. The story, a deeply researched and sensitively written piece, painted a picture of a woman so consumed by ambition that she had sacrificed the most fundamental human connection. The public, which had been so quick to condemn Victoria, now turned on Isabella with a vengeance. She was no longer the brilliant, wronged woman. She was a monster, a modern-day Medea. The board of Thorne Holdings, already on edge, saw their worst fears realized. Isabella was not just a liability, she was a toxic asset. In a swift, unanimous decision, they terminated her contract, citing a breach of the company's ethics clause. Isabella was ruined. Her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed lifeite was all gone. She had played with fire, and she had been consumed by the flames. Edward, watching this all unfold, was a man in turmoil. He felt a grim satisfaction at Isabella's downfall, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of guilt. He had created this monster, had fed her ambition, had been complicit in her rise, and he had allowed her to hurt Victoria in the most brutal way imaginable. He knew he had to do something to atone for his sins, to try and salvage some semblance of the man he once was. He called a press conference, a move that stunned his lawyers and the board of Thorn Holdings. He stood before the cameras, not as the powerful CEO, but as a broken man. He confessed everything: the affair, the lies, the deceit. He took full responsibility for his actions, for the pain he had caused his wife, for the chaos he had unleashed upon his company. He announced that he was taking an indefinite leave of absence from Thorn Holdings, that he was going to focus on his personal life, on trying to earn back the trust of the woman he loved. It was a stunning, unprecedented act of public contrition. It was also a brilliant strategic move. By falling on his own sword, he had preempted any further attacks, had taken the wind out of the sails of his detractors. He had, in a single act of humility, begun the long, arduous process of rebuilding his life and his reputation. Victoria watched the press conference from her apartment, her heart a tumultuous mix of emotions. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse in his voice. But she also saw the man who had shattered her world, the man who had stood by while another woman sat in her chair. The war was not over, but the battlefield had shifted. Isabella was gone. Edward was humbled. And Victoria, the pregnant wife who had walked into her husband's office and found her life in ruins, was now in a position of unimaginable power. The future of Thorn Holdings, the fate of the man she had once loved, was now in her hands. The unraveling was complete, and from the wreckage, a new, uncertain future was about to be born. Months later, as the first crimson leaves of autumn began to fall, Victoria gave birth to Theo Thorn. Holding him for the first time, she felt a peace that washed away the last vestiges of the storm. All the pain, all the fighting, it had all led to this perfect, tiny miracle in her arms. Edward heard the news from Arthur Vance via a single, formal text message. He drove back to the city, a man hollowed out by guilt and electrified by a fragile, terrifying hope. He found her not in a private luxury suite, but in a standard room in the maternity ward, the glittering city skyline a backdrop to a scene of quiet intimacy. He paused in the doorway, a ghost at the feast. She wasn't wearing seraphine or surrounded by lavish bouquets. She was just Victoria, holding their son, her face illuminated by a soft lamp, radiating a strength and serenity that took his breath away. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in them, but no welcome either, just a quiet, guarded stillness. He took a hesitant step into the room, his expensive shoes silent on the linoleum floor. "He's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. "Yes," Victoria replied, her voice soft but firm, her gaze shifting back to the baby in her arms. "He is." She didn't ask him to come closer. She didn't offer for him to hold his son. The space between them was a chasm miles wide and fathoms deep, filled with the wreckage of their past. Edward stood there, a king in exile, looking at the two people who were his entire world, knowing he had no right to either of them. But in the weeks and months that followed, something began to shift. Edward didn't plead or promise. He acted. He poured his energy not into his business, but into a charitable foundation he established in his father's name, focusing on building affordable housing and community art centers, the very things Victoria was passionate about. He attended every therapy session. He sent handwritten letters, not asking for forgiveness, but simply telling her about his day, about a book he'd read, or a memory of her that had made him smile. He was learning patience, humility, and the art of showing up without demanding entry. Victoria, now a formidable member of the Thorn Holdings board, watched from a distance. She, along with the new CEO, was reshaping the company, infusing it with an integrity it had long lacked. She was a brilliant mother, a respected leader, and a woman who had found her own power. She didn't need him. And perhaps, that was why she finally let him in. It started with a text. Theo laughed for the first time today. I have a video if you want to see it. Edward was at her door in 20 minutes, not with flowers, but with a simple bag of groceries. Slowly, cautiously, he became a part of their lives. He learned to change diapers, to warm bottles, to walk the floors with a crying baby at 3 a.m. in the guest room she'd set up for him. He was no longer the billionaire magnate, but simply Dada. One crisp spring afternoon, a year after their world had shattered, they found themselves walking through Central Park. Theo, now a toddler, took his first wobbly steps on the green grass, stumbling from his father's outstretched hands into his mother's loving arms. Watching their son giggle between them, Edward finally found the words. I know I destroyed the fairy tale, Victoria. I know I can never give that back to you. Victoria looked at him, her eyes clear and honest. The fairy tale was an illusion, Edward. It wasn't real. She then reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. But this, she said, squeezing gently as they both watched their son, this is real. And it's better. It was not a return to the past, but the first step into a new, stronger future, one built not on a flawless fantasy, but on the hard-won truths of forgiveness, redemption, and a love that was brave enough to rebuild itself from the ashes. The story of Victoria Thorne is a stark reminder that the deepest betrayals can often forge the most unbreakable strength. We've journeyed with her from the dizzying heights of a fairy tale life to the crushing depths of heartbreak and watched as she rose from the ashes, not as a victim, but as a victor. Her fight was not just for herself but for the future of her child, a testament to the fierce, unyielding power of a mother's love. We saw a family shattered and then, slowly and carefully, pieced back together into something more real and more resilient than ever before. If Victoria's journey of resilience and rebirth has moved you, if the drama of the Thorne Empire has captivated you, please show your support. Like this video, share it with others who appreciate a story of strength against all odds, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love, loss, and the indomitable human spirit. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light. What do you think of their new beginning? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.